Thank you, Paula. Good evening, everyone. Our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Veena Singla. Veena is a senior scientist with the Natural Resources Defense Council. The Natural Resources Defense Council is a nonprofit international environmental advocacy group headquartered in New York City with offices located throughout the world. Veena will be sharing her in-depth research on the health and environmental impacts of chemical recycling. Chemical recycling is an umbrella term for a set of technologies that convert plastic and other waste into a burnable fuel, chemicals, or raw materials for new plastics. Almost all of the existing chemical recycling plants in the US are plastic to fuel facilities. The reason we've invited Veena to speak is because Tucson Environmental and General Services Department for the last couple of years has been studying options for hosting a waste to energy facility at the Los Reales Municipal Landfill, which is located on the southeast side of the city. The department has received 9 specific chemical recycling project ideas for the landfill, 7 that would convert plastics and other waste into a burnable fuel, and 2 that would convert plastics into raw materials to make new plastic. Tucson Environmental and General Services is also considering waste energy technologies that would combust mixed solid waste to create electricity and convert plastics, paper, and other materials into fuel pellets that will be burned in cement kilns and other industrial facilities. A little more background on Veena. She is an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia University, and her research focus is on investigating how toxic chemicals and pollution related to materials use, production, and disposal threaten the health of impacted communities. Veena holds a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD in cell biology from the University of California, San Francisco. Veena currently serves on the US EPA's Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee, the National Toxicology Program Board of Scientific Counselors, and the Board of Directors for Clean Production Action. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Veena, and I'd like to ask that we hold questions until the end of her presentation, but at the same time, you can post questions during the presentation in the chat box, which Paula and I will monitor, and we'll try to make sure we get to everybody's questions. So take it away, Veena.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and good evening, everyone. It's great to see so much interest in this topic, and I'm going to share my presentation here. And yes, I'll be talking a lot more about chemical recycling and what it is, what it entails, and some of the concerns that I've found in my research. So as Kevin noted, NRDC, we're an international environmental nonprofit that employs scientists like myself, as well as attorneys and policy advocates to advance evidence-based policies to protect human health and the environment. So what I want to discuss today before we get into in-depth on chemical recycling is just to take a step back and think a little bit more about the optimal approaches to materials management and where recycling fits into that. Then I'll go into more of what I found in my research on US chemical recycling facilities, and then go into more detail on the various technologies and some of the facilities employing these technologies. And then I'll end with just thinking a little bit about mechanical versus chemical recycling and the benefits and downsides to each. So the materials management hierarchy, this is probably very familiar to all of you folks that are part of this group, but just to revisit briefly, the best waste management strategy is not to make waste. So it's prevention, right? Source reduction. So reduce the amount of packaging, make it reusable, make foodware refillable so that you're not creating waste. You can lightweight packaging, reduce the amount that you're using, reuse, and then you can see we're many levels in before we even get to recycle. So recycling is an important tool in our toolbox for managing materials, but it's not the most impactful or effective when we're thinking about general materials management strategies. Okay, so before I get into chemical recycling, just a quick review of how plastic is made, because this will be important for understanding how chemical recycling works and what it's trying to do. So plastic, 99% of plastics are made from fossil fuels, and these synthetic chemicals are created. They're called monomers. They're individual chemical units. You can think of them as kind of like an individual bead that might form a necklace. And these monomers, many of them are toxic in of themselves. So examples are styrene or vinyl chloride. Both are carcinogens. Vinyl chloride made even more infamous by the recent awful Ohio train derailment. So those are the individual units that make up the plastic polymer. So that's when those units get linked together. So you can think about putting those beads together onto a necklace. And then you get polystyrene, also known as styrofoam or polyvinyl chloride. So you can see that poly in front telling you those are the individual units linked together. So that's the plastic polymer. And then what happens is a bunch of other stuff gets added to make the final plastic material. So additives like pigments, plasticizers, UV stabilizers, flame retardants, many hundreds of chemicals can go into an individual plastic material. And there's 10,000 or more known additives that go into various plastics. And then you get that with the additives, the further processing into plastic products. Okay, so mechanical recycling, this is the kind of recycling that we're all very familiar with, the kind that's happening today, that the small amount of plastic that is recycled using mechanical recycling. So that's where plastic waste is collected, it's sorted by type, cleaned, and then shredded into plastic pellets, and the new plastic products can be molded from those pellets. And why is recycling in general a good thing? Why do we want to try to do this? Well, the idea is, here you can see the kind of material cycle with the extraction of natural resources on the left, where the product gets made, it's used, and then into the end of life management, where if you can recover and recycle those materials and feed them back into that material cycle, then what you can do is decrease waste, right? That's going for disposal, as well as decrease the demand for extraction of those virgin resources. So again, that kind of idea of feeding materials back into this material cycle is why recycling is a very good thing when we're actually closing this loop and putting materials back into the cycle. Now, chemical recycling, as Kevin noted, it's not one thing. Chemical recycling is an umbrella term that's used to encompass many different processes. So I think there is kind of two levels of confusion. One is that there's a lot of different terms that people use to refer to chemical recycling. You might have heard advanced recycling, molecular recycling, plastics upcycling, chemically advanced molecular recycling. There is kind of this constant rebranding going on of what these processes are called. But all of these terms refer to the same set of things, these different processes that are chemical recycling. So pyrolysis and gasification, depolymerization, all these technical terms that refer to different kinds of chemical recycling processes. And what they have in common is that they use heat or chemicals or both to break down plastic. And we'll talk more about that. And I think one important thing to note about these different processes is that pyrolysis and gasification stand out from the other ones because they're thermal conversion processes. They use high heat to break down the materials that go into the process, and pyrolysis and gasification units are classified as incineration under the Clean Air Act for that reason. Okay, so now chemical recycling, what's going on here? Well, we're talking about chemical recycling of plastic waste. We start with the same stuff as mechanical recycling. This is plastic waste that's sorted by type and then fed into these processes. So again, they all have in common, they're going to use heat or chemicals or both to break down the plastic. And then we can go on these different pathways. We can create a fuel that gets burned for energy, or chemical components that can be used to make other chemicals, or turned back into plastic, which would be recycling if that, that very lower right-hand pathway, if we're going back to plastic. Okay, but those other pathways, when we're turning plastic to fuel or chemicals, it's not recycling, because you can see as you go over this circle, when you get to that end of life, the plastic to fuel, the materials are burned for energy. So they're not feeding back into this cycle. And the same with plastic to chemicals. If those chemicals aren't used to make new plastic, you're not feeding back into this cycle. So you have to continue to extract more resources to make more plastic if you're not actually recycling the plastic. Okay, so when I started this research a couple of years ago, I heard a lot of excitement about chemical recycling or advanced recycling, that this was these new technologies that were going to allow us to recycle hard to recycle plastics, really address the plastic waste crisis, and help us solve the plastic pollution problem. So I was very intrigued and hopeful, actually, when I started looking into this, that maybe this was going to be something helpful, because we all know plastic waste is a huge problem. So I wanted to know more about what was happening at these chemical recycling facilities. So what I did was I started with industry and NGO reports and compiled a list of all the different chemical recycling companies that were mentioned. So I had a list of hundreds of companies. Then I narrowed it down to those that were in the US and still in business, because a number of them had actually never opened. There was an announcement that they never opened, or they opened and then closed down pretty quickly. Then I narrowed it down even further to facilities where I could find publicly available information, like reporting in the US EPA Environmental Protection Agency databases, air permits from the states where the facilities were located, or other information that indicated they're operational or near operational. So that led me to 8 facilities. So here are the facilities I looked at down the left-hand side there. And then across the top are the 5 different sources of information that I looked at or looked for each facility. So again, the state permit data. I looked in EPA's Environmental Compliance and History online database. So that's where violations or citations that EPA finds are issued for facilities. I also looked at EPA's toxics release inventory, or TRI, where facilities report releases of toxic chemicals. And then I looked at EPA's Resource Conservation and Recovery Act data, where companies are reporting hazardous waste that they're generating and how they're disposing of it. And then for all of the facilities, I used EPA's environmental justice screening tool to do a demographic analysis of who was living around these facilities. And what did I find? So this is a map showing where the facilities are located, and then what kind of chemical recycling are they doing? Plastic to fuel, plastic to chemicals, which of those processes are they doing? And indeed, most of them are doing plastic to fuel. They're not actually recycling any plastic. I also found in the air permits that these facilities are allowed to release a variety of hazardous air pollutants. So down the left-hand side are the chemicals that were listed in the facilities' air permits, and across the top are the health hazards that these chemicals have. So you can see a variety of them are cancer causing, they're carcinogens, they're toxic to the reproductive system, they're toxic to the developing fetus. So definitely of concern for children's health and anyone who lives near these facilities and could be exposed to these hazardous air pollutants. I also found that the facilities were generally sited in communities that were disproportionately people of color, low-income communities, or both. So here across the top are the different facilities. Then next is the location of the facility. And then under that is the number of people living within a 3-mile radius of the facility. So that's where I looked for the demographic information, is 3 miles around the facility. And then you can see the demographic breakdown following by income level or race or ethnicity. And on the very right-hand side, you can see the US average across the entire US for those characteristics. So in general, across the US, about 20% of the population is considered low income, with the household income below $25,000. And then highlighted in orange you can see where the population surrounding these facilities is significantly higher than that. So you can see, again, a number of these facilities cited in places where the population is disproportionately low income, or Black, or Hispanic or Latino. Okay, so all of that information that I just presented is available in this issue brief that's online. And I can drop the link in the chat later as well. And now I'm going to talk more about some of these specific technologies and the particular facilities employing them. So here, let's take a look at this waste to fuel or plastic to fuel. So generally, the waste to fuel or plastic to fuel technologies are pyrolysis and gasification. That's what they're doing to turn waste or plastic into fuel. And they use high heat and high pressure. So they have high energy requirements, and they requires usually some fossil fuel combustion to get this process started. So you start with plastic waste, you need to put it under that high heat, and then you get these breakdown products. Then what happens is a significant amount of those breakdown products are actually fed back into the system and burned to power the process. So they're using some of those breakdown products as fuel just within the system, and then some of those breakdown products are taken as outputs, which are processed as the product, so the fuel that they can sell as their product. So this is a very inefficient process. What you see is that if you're thinking about, okay, of the inputs, right, like that plastic waste, like if you had 100 kilograms of plastic waste going in, then how much would be coming out as the product, as the actual fuel? So for pyrolysis, it's about 0.1% to 5.7% of the inputs that actually get turned into outputs, and gasification 1.7% to 14%. So it's pretty inefficient. Because of these high energy requirements and how much of the breakdown products are actually used just to power the process. So here's what this looks like for one of these facilities. Brightmark, located in Ashley, Indiana. They're doing pyrolysis of mixed plastic waste to fuel. We haven't yet seen a viable product from them, but here's what they told EPA, where in this table, there's the output material category on the left-hand side. So syngas, that's the broken down plastic stuff, and then their product, the liquid fuel, and then byproduct char. So you can see that 70% of what they're producing is the breakdown products that's just rerouted to the system or flared off. Only 20% is actually the fuel product, and then the 10% that's waste, that's landfilled. So again, just very inefficient. Here's some other concerns about these plastic to fuel pyrolysis processes. These two facilities, Altera and Braven, located in Ohio and North Carolina.
By Portland.
Oh, sorry. Was there a question? No. Okay, I'll go on. They're both doing pyrolysis of mixed plastic waste to fuel, and you can see they're generating pretty large quantities of hazardous waste. Altera generated 63,000 pounds in 2021, Braven 19,000 pounds in 2021. Braven also had a hazardous waste violation last year, where EPA issued an imminent and substantial endangerment order. So very concerning for anyone that lives near that facility. Okay, so that's the plastic to fuel. What about this plastic to chemicals? What's going on there? So one of the facilities that's doing this is called Agilix, that's located in Oregon, and they're taking polystyrene waste. So that's your styrofoam, you know, your foam takeout containers, your red Solo cups. A lot of times cutlery is made of polystyrene. So they're taking that polystyrene waste, doing pyrolysis to turn it back into its original chemical. Remember that monomer, that original bead, the styrene. And then in theory, they could take that styrene and turn it back into polystyrene. So that's the idea. But what we see when we look at their reporting data is very odd that they're actually sending their supposed product, that styrene, to incineration to be disposed and burned. So this is data from the toxics release inventory. It's the pounds of styrene that Agilix sent for incineration in these years. So both 2019 and 2020, they sent over 100,000 pounds of their supposed product to be burned for disposal. So something's not right. It's unclear if the product just isn't pure enough to be made into new plastic, if there's not a market. So something's not working with what's going on there. And then on top of that, they're producing lots of hazardous waste as well. So almost 500,000 pounds in 2019. This table shows on the left-hand side the chemical composition of the hazardous waste, then in the middle, how much was generated, and on the right-hand side, how it was disposed. And so it all involves burning in one respect or another, either direct incineration or burning for energy recovery or being blended into a fuel to be later burned. And benzene, that's the largest chemical that they generated. Benzene is a known carcinogen. And they shipped this to 6 different locations across the country for disposal. So their waste is not just affecting their specific facility in that site, but now it's affecting 6 other communities where this hazardous waste is being burned. Okay, now let's look at this last pathway, where we could actually be recycling the plastic to plastic. So this is the one where if it worked, then this could be a good thing for recycling plastic. So this process is called solvent purification. And what they do is they, again, start with the same thing, plastic waste that's sorted by type. And then they dissolve the plastic with chemicals, with strong solvents. And then you get this kind of dissolved plastic, and they can separate away that polymer from all those additives, right? Those colors, the pigments, the other chemicals that have been added to the plastic material, separate those out. You're left with the polymer, and then you can use that to make new plastic products. So, you know, add new additives, create your new plastic. So one facility doing this is called PureCycle, also located in Ohio. They're taking polypropylene waste and then generating the polypropylene polymers. So this is your yogurt tubs, those kinds of containers are typically made of polypropylene. So their air permit, they're permitted to release volatile organic chemicals and other air pollutants. So VOCs, they're health harming themselves, they're respiratory irritants, they're linked to causing and exacerbating asthma. VOCs also contribute to smog formation. So PureCycle is required to flare or burn off the excess VOCs that it generates. It's also registered as a large quantity hazardous waste generator. And we also don't have any indication that their process is yet working to produce any product at scale. Okay, so I've just given you quite a bit of information on all of these different chemical recycling technologies. So I'll just sum up to say that there's a few things they all have in common, even though they're different in the details. One, they all lack transparency, in that I had a pretty hard time finding information about these processes and facilities. I got the publicly available information that's required by law to be reported to EPA. But other than that, these companies are very secretive about what they're doing and, you know, how much plastic they're taking in, how much product they're generating, if any, what they're recycling, how much waste they're generating. That's not required to be reported. So this lack of transparency is problematic to understand these technologies better. They're all generating harmful air pollution, and they all are doing one or more of these things. They're either using hazardous chemicals, producing hazardous chemicals, or generating hazardous waste. And some of them are doing all of those things. None of them seem to be yet operating at scale, whether that's due to process or product problems. And they are all generally cited in these low-income communities or communities that are people of color. And then pyrolysis and gasification specifically have these additional concerns associated with them. So these are the high heat processes that are classified as incineration. They're energy intensive and inefficient. They're generating hazardous waste, and they're mostly used for plastic to fuel, not for recycling. Okay, so mechanical recycling. This is what's happening to recycle plastic that's recycled today. Again, not a whole lot, but some is happening. So it has some of the same problems where the infrastructure is generally cited in communities of color, low-income communities, and it's generating some harmful emissions. But what we see is that the harmful emissions are much less, they're fewer and at lower levels compared to what we see for chemical recycling. And the emissions are coming from the plastic itself. So microplastics, VOCs, flame retardants, other things that are added to the plastic. And mechanical recycling itself doesn't use additional hazardous chemicals or generate hazardous waste. There's no incineration or combustion, and it's fairly efficient. So we're seeing 73 to 84% of what comes in gets converted to recycled product, depending on the kind of plastic. So our approach is to focus at the top of this materials management hierarchy first and foremost, to really deal with our plastic problem, right? So just prevent that waste in the first place, eliminate problematic and unnecessary plastics like single use, some of the most toxic materials like PVC, those are unrecyclable. Focus our investments and policy incentives on developing reuse and refill systems, as well as developing safer and non-fossil fuel-based materials that can feed into non-toxic material cycles, right? Whether that's recycling or composting. And that is all I have. And I will stop talking now so that we can all talk. Thank you.
If you have a question, if you can hit that reactions button at the bottom and raise your hand, or put your question in the chat box. I guess I'd like to start with a question for you, Veena. Have you looked at is there any research that compares the carbon footprint of chemical recycling versus mechanical recycling, or is there any reason, that's number one, or is there research that compares the carbon footprint of making diesel fuel from plastics versus crude oil, making it the traditional, conventional way?
Thank you, Kevin, for those questions. Great questions. So yes, when we look at mechanical recycling compared to chemical recycling on greenhouse gas or kind of carbon emissions, we see that mechanical recycling is much less GHG or carbon intensive than chemical recycling in general. And to what extent will vary based on which chemical recycling technology we're talking about. So like, for example, pyrolysis and gasification that are very energy intensive, mechanical recycling is like hundreds of times better, right? But then for some of the other processes that are less energy intensive, mechanical recycling may be 10 times better. So it's still better, but it just depends on which technology you're comparing it to. And I would add to that across the various metrics that you compare mechanical and chemical recycling, mechanical tends to do better when you're looking at different environmental and health impacts. So on like other air pollution, toxicity, impacts to water, in all of these respects, mechanical recycling tends to perform better than chemical recycling. I'd say the place where chemical recycling looks better is on the sort of technical performance of the product, right? That for something like solvent purification, where you're actually able to purify away the additives and just get the pure polymer at the end, that performance as a recycled material is better than mechanical recycling, because you can't do that with mechanical recycling, right? Like all of the additives, everything that's in there is in the recycled product. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Cecily, you have a question.
Yeah, I was wondering, that was excellent, by the way, a really wonderful presentation. I was wondering whether the toxic waste material that the different chemical recycling processes produce, is that the ash, or is it other things as well? Like, what is the hazardous waste that they're putting in the trucks and trucking away?
That's a great question. So I would say we know the chemical composition of the hazardous waste based on what the companies have reported. So, for example, the information I showed you from Agilix, where benzene was like the top thing, and that's what we're seeing across the different chemical recycling facilities, that they're all reporting generating a large amount of benzene hazardous waste. So we know what it is, but where does it come from, right? Like, what is it about their process or the inputs that's generating a lot of benzene? That's something we're not sure about, because we don't have enough information about the process of the inputs that the companies are using, because it could be coming from.
Ask her about that.
Oh, hey Kevin, did you? I don't know if you knew you're not on mute. So that benzene could be coming from breaking down the plastic itself, or it could be coming from chemicals that they're adding into the process, like solvents or something else, or maybe it's a combination of those things. We're not sure, but something about their process and the inputs is generating a lot of hazardous waste.
And is benzene a liquid or a gas, or?
So it's a volatile organic chemical. So it can be a liquid or gas at room temperature. The way that they're shipping it is usually as a liquid.
Right. And so that recent horrible, crash with all of the toxic chemicals, that was in Ohio, I think. And that was mostly benzene, was it? Or
that
does it relate to any of this work?
Vinyl chloride.
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, the vinyl chloride was a major thing that train was carrying. So that's the initial ingredient to make polyvinyl chloride.
Make it, right.
Yeah.
Okay. So not related in any way to these facilities?
No, not directly.
Not yet.
No, not yet.
Okay, thank you.
Stuart, you have a question.
Thank you. This was very informative. Going back to early in your presentation, you said chemical recycling has many names, and you listed 5 or 6. And I wasn't quite clear. Do these all refer to the same thing or to different processes?
They're all referring to the same thing, different names, same thing.
Okay, thank you.
Paula.
Yeah, thanks. This has been incredibly informative. I was wondering, you mentioned with one of the plants that produced a lot of VOCs, they were required to flare off the excess, but does the EPA or any other state or federal agency require some other way of collecting or capping or somehow mitigating the release of all of these byproducts, hazardous byproducts into the air or the water or wherever it's going?
Thank you for that question. So I would say it depends on which particular pollutant we're talking about and the amounts in question, because I'll just say in general, the way the Clean Air Act works is that you're allowed to pollute a certain amount, just kind of as a foundational thing. And then again, depending on the particular chemical and kind of facility and location, there may be specific requirements for installing technologies to scrub certain pollutants from the emissions, right? Like to collect them so they never get released, or like the example I mentioned where they burn them off so that the VOCs aren't released. So you certainly can have requirements to scrub, right? Just remove those pollutants from ever being released. But it just is just going to depend on what the particular pollutant and facility is.
Dwayne, you have a question?
I hope I can limit it to a reasonable amount. I have too many questions. I guess most of my questions are in two directions, either in the financial aspect and how these companies can be solvent, quote unquote, and secondly, second direction is, have you also looked into community processes that have done a successful job of questioning potential deals that would culminate in the creation of one of these plants, such as we are facing in Tucson right now? And I guess just a little bit more on the financial side. First, how do they make money? And is one of the ways that they make money a form of using incentives that are supposed to be based on environmental concerns in an absurd fashion? I don't know. I'm guessing.
It's a very good guess, Dwayne, because that is definitely some of what's going on. So, right, in terms of how are these facilities financially viable, I would say to a large extent, we've seen that they don't work out very, very well economically. That I mentioned at the beginning when I was looking for the list of facilities that was operational or near operational, that what I found was quite a number had sort of tried to start up and then were just, going for a year, 2 years, 3 years, a very short amount of time, and then had to shut down because of problems, and they just weren't economically viable. And what we see currently is that a number of these companies are pursuing public money to be able to support their actual kind of construction and operation. So one facility that was proposed for Macon, Georgia, the entire cost for the facility was $650 million, and they were going after $500 million from the Industrial Authority in incentives to construct that facility. So really just the majority, right, of what it would cost to finance the facility. And that's also an example of your other question of where communities have successfully pushed back on some of these chemical recycling facility proposals. So that deal in Macon looked like it was a done deal, and the mayor was on board, the Industrial Authority was on board. It looked like it was going forward, and the community raised some serious questions about what was in the facility's permits and the fact that the facility, so that it was going to be another Brightmark facility. That's one of the companies that I mentioned. They already have a facility in Ohio. And part of the deal was supposed to be that they demonstrated viable product at their Ohio facility before they built in Georgia, and they weren't able to do that. So the community again really questioned, should we be going forward with this? We don't even know they're going to generate viable product. Just raised a lot of concerns, a lot of questions, and eventually the mayor turned around on that deal. They were able to successfully oppose it.
My wife Naomi has a question.
Hi, yeah, so I'm kind of following up on what Dwayne was asking too, and maybe I'm wondering if you have any data on the facilities that either didn't open or shortly shut down. Were they prompted by the community? Was it prompted by a government agency coming in and shutting them down, or media, or which was more prominent?
I would say for those that actually started and then shut down, it seemed to be just technical and financial issues that did it, where they were not able to scale up their process in a way that worked, because what we've seen over and over again is that these technologies work in a laboratory or kind of pilot setting where there's perfect conditions and you have like really nice clean inputs, right, that you're testing out. But then you go into the real world with actual post-consumer plastic waste. I mean, we've all seen like what's in a recycling bin, right? It's all kinds of stuff. There's labels, there's stuff that's not supposed to be there, there's food that's contaminating. So like it's a pretty complex mix of stuff that you have to sort and clean. And when you get those kinds of inputs coupled with trying to scale up the process, it just seems like the facilities aren't able to do it. So those technical issues seem to have been a big challenge. And then with that, they're not able to make enough money or make enough product.
Thank you.
Barb, you have a question.
Are you muted? Oh.
I can kind of see why pyrolysis appeals to some communities. I'm sure many larger cities just have mountains and mountains of garbage. they don't know what else to do. So they go, oh, we'll burn it. Okay. And then they probably get a greenwash sell from the companies and then they go along with it. But it just seems like, I don't understand why efforts aren't being made more on the supply side. I really don't. I mean, there's alternatives, and why is it always just a bottom line cost when we know that the long-term costs of this garbage in our environment and burning and the carcinogens? I don't know. It just, I know I'm asking a rhetorical question. It just is kind of frustrating. I don't understand why more is not being done on the supply end to offer options to consumers.
Yeah, I love that. I love that question and that frame, because and yes, Susan has a huge part of the answer there in the chat, right? That the plastics and fossil fuel industry don't want to see their products go down, right? Like the general trend we're seeing with the fossil fuel industry is that we're successfully slowly starting to move away from the use of fossil fuels as fuels, right? Like for generating power in our power plants, for powering our vehicles, for powering our buildings, like all of these uses that are the major uses of fossil fuels. And they're doubling down and betting on petrochemical and plastic production. Like where we're seeing a bunch of the investments for the big fossil fuel companies is on expanding their plastic production, right? Like that's where they're looking. And so it's not going to work for their business model if we actually cut down on plastic use. So they definitely are pushing on the policy front, whether we're talking about local, state, federal, international, to oppose things like single-use plastic bans or plastic bag bans, like anything that is going to reduce the use of plastic, they're pushing hard against. But I think those are the real solutions, right? When cities can come up with zero waste plans, can do the bag bans, do the single-use bans, do the what is it called? New York City just did it, where it's like only on request, where like when you get food delivery and takeout, they'll provide the plastic stuff only if the customer requests it. Those kinds of things are what is going to help reduce the waste generated.
Yeah, I've noticed that. I would like
Thank you. Yes, skip the stuff.
Yeah, I would like to see the city of Tucson put more emphasis upstream on zero waste solutions. And when you look at other communities like San Francisco or Portland or Boulder, they're working with the business groups and others to come up with alternative product delivery systems, and such as a subscription program for reusable takeout containers or for leftovers. And it certainly, I could see why, as Barb mentioned, pyrolysis, and they're very appealing because it's kind of like a black box. It's going to take care of everything. It's a techno fix. And whereas setting up programs and trying to shift to more reuse and refill and to encourage the community to do that, requires some resources from the city. On the other hand, I agree with you, the policy, we should be mandating some of these things, especially at the federal level, to force the consumer brand companies to take more responsibility for the waste that's being generated. Stuart, you have a question.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks again, Veena. It sounds as though, in answer to Dwayne and Kevin and others, that I'm going to try to summarize what I think you're suggesting. If we want to persuade the city to do something different than hire one of these companies, they need to look at financing issues. They need to look at what will be permitted, because that'll give us a view into what pollution we are purchasing for our community. They need to look at evidence of any viable products from the proposing companies' other places, and then look at the industry-wide record of failure. And then there's the carbon cost, there's water pollution, and then, of course, the other side is what are the better alternatives? And I've heard so far only on request provision of SUPs, single-use plastics, going upstream in a very, very assertive manner, and doing lots of fun stuff like the subscription system for takeout containers. Did I leave anything out?
I think that's a really good list, Stuart. Thank you for. I'm like, I wish I wrote that down. It's a good thing this is recorded. I might come back to this. That was a very good summary. I think the only thing I would add to that is for the city to have a strong community engagement process where they can kind of hear directly from all folks like you, everyone else who lives in the community, like what you want and need, right? And in terms of what you think are good solutions, what's going to serve you and all of the goals you as a community have.
Yeah, Kevin was initiating that, trying to initiate that with the city. And so far, even talking to our representatives, they essentially, well, Kevin, I'll let you explain.
Early on in the process, we suggested to the Environmental Services Department that they create a stakeholder group early on and use that group to help screen technologies and programs and policies to come up with a way to come up with criteria for how to evaluate different approaches for reducing our waste generation. And we haven't gotten too far, I guess. I'm very disappointed with the whole process because it's being conducted behind closed doors, whereas other cities have spent a year and a half holding multiple meetings, creating zero waste plans, getting the stakeholders engaged in that decision-making process rather than reacting to something. I'm very worried that the city of Tucson will announce something and all of a sudden now we're in reactive mode, which will make things very difficult, I think, to have an impact. So I'm hoping that we can still get through. We've initiated a bit of a campaign to encourage people to write to the mayor's office and to the city council members, urging them to look at other options and open up the process so that it's more democratic. And and I'm not just talking about the NGOs and bring the business community in, the property managers, and get a dialogue going. Paula.
Yeah, I do have a question, but I would like first to respond to a comment that Eileen put in the chat, which is to recommend that that people look at an organization called Beyond Plastics. And I want to mention that Sustainable Tucson is an affiliate of Beyond Plastics. And at least some of us, probably Kevin and me, and maybe a few others, will be listening in on their affiliate meeting tomorrow evening. But it really is a tremendous resource, a lot of really great information. My question is, what kinds of plastics are used as the feedstock for these various chemical recycling facilities? Do they take anything, or is it just just ones and twos, 1 through 7? We now have this project going on with a company called Bifusion making plastic construction blocks, and they are collecting anything plastic, any kind of plastic. So I was just wondering about the chemical recycling facilities, what they take.
Yeah, so it depends on the particular technology that the facility is using. But in general, it's 1, 2, 4, or 5, or some combination thereof. None of them want PVC. PVC, it poisons all of their processes. So there was kind of this messaging that chemical recycling can take just mixed plastic waste, we can take anything and recycle it. And that's not actually the case. They do have to have sorted plastic, and in general, they're looking at the same kinds of plastics that mechanical recycling is looking at.
Dwayne, you have your hand up?
Go ahead, Mark. I took mine down.
Oh, Mark.
Thank you. Just a very nice presentation. Thank you very much. I just wanted to point out that, and it has been mentioned that I'm aware of, that the city of Tucson is limited by the state in what we can do. We can't have a bag denial. We can't do, I don't know how many different things we can't do because the state won't let us do that as a city, charter city. So, of course, this means that we have to get businesses to voluntarily do something to reduce waste, and that's a difficult thing to get your arms around, I think. So, just wanted to point that out. Thank you very much. This is great.
Thank you, Mark, for that. It's sobering for sure. And I'll say the plastics industry has been successful at getting some of those ban policies passed at the state level, right? Where they're basically disallowing localities from banning plastic bags or other single-use items. So it's quite unfortunate. But I did want to end on a hopeful note, in that, you know, the amount of plastic in our lives is a pretty new thing, right? This is something that's happened within, you know, a lot of our living lifetimes. For, you know, we could all remember a time we had way less plastic stuff. So we know how to live with less plastic, and we can certainly do it again.
Well, I want to thank you, Veena. This was really great. Great questions too, and also some of the comments in the chat box were very good as well. And hopefully you've given us some additional areas to explore and some different ways that we can kind of think about the issue and hopefully have some impact here locally, so we can steer away from these kinds of technologies and move forward and do it in a way that brings the community together. Because I don't think we're going to, there's no silver bullet for dealing with this. It's going to require a lot of different actions and encouragement and resources and so on, and leadership. And I think the city can do that. And that's what we're still going to push on, that concept of open up this process, get people involved. Stuart, did you want to say anything?
Thanks, Kevin. I just was going to put in the chat that if people would like to be on a list to know topics to write letters to legislators, to city council, et cetera, then our advocacy coordinator is Jana Siegel. That's Jana, Jana at sustainabletucson.org. And I'm sure Kevin will be feeding stuff to her on this topic. And I'll just join everybody and say thank you so much, Veena. That was really great.
Thank you all for your great work. I'm very, very happy to have been part of the discussion. And Kevin, feel free to reach out if I can support anything y'all are doing on this.
I appreciate this, because you kind of have a higher perspective. You're looking at a variety of communities and seeing what's working, what's not working. So I'm sure there's some things we can learn from what's going on in other communities as well. I'm going to turn things back over to Paula.
Well,
for announcements.
Yeah, I also want to thank you, Veena. This was really incredibly informative and gave us a lot of good ammunition to use as we do contact our elected officials about the issue. If anyone has, before that, I want to just mention, since we recorded this, it will be available on the Sustainable Tucson YouTube channel, probably within about a week. So you can re-listen, share it with other folks who weren't able to make it tonight, and just be able to have access to wonderful information. Yes, so does anyone have any announcements to make for events coming up that you want to be sure not to miss? I don't see any hands. I will remind you our next, yes.
I just wanted to ask a question. I came in a little late and I'm from Massachusetts, and I was just curious, if you don't mind, this proposal in Tucson, would it be supported with tax breaks and tax dollars? Because that seems like another thing to campaign on, if it would be tax breaks as much as tax dollars. Do you know, or maybe that's not known yet?
That's not known yet. The city hasn't made a decision, but they've been spending an inordinate amount of time looking at these technologies over the last 2 years. And they actually issued a request for information, not a request for proposals, but information out to the vendors to find out what kind of what I call downstream waste management processing technologies that might make sense to host at the landfill. They're trying to reimagine, the city leaders are trying to reimagine what the landfill could be looking at. And there were some good proposals, mechanical recycling proposals, some reuse proposals, but they've been spending a lot of time looking at these waste energy proposals. They seem to be dominating right now, and but we don't know yet. We don't know the answer to your questions about whether or not they'll have to put together some kind of a financial package to assist.
I would definitely consider that as you're developing your ammunition, because I would guess they'll be doing a tax break kind of thing of some sort to get the companies to come. But, well, good luck to all of you. You're fighting a good fight. I'm going to sign off.
Follow along, you can check things out. You're welcome to get the Sustainable Tucson newsletter if you don't already. And we'll probably have things in our newsletter and on our website as this all progresses. And
you know, one thing we probably ought to think about is language and refuse to use that term waste to energy. I mean, that's total greenwashing right there, that name.
Yeah, that has come up before, that the important thing is to call it incineration, because it's really focusing on the burning. So good point, and a good reminder.